Welcome to tonight's Bible study, and thank you for taking the time to watch this video, and I hope that it is a blessing to you. Tonight, we continue our Lenten Bible study. Lent is a 40-day journey which begins in the wilderness of testing and temptation and ends at the cross. As we retrace the steps of Jesus's journey to the cross, it is the hope of Lent that through prayer, reflection, and action, that we will draw closer to Christ. The inspiration for this Bible study comes from the song that we often sing during our Holy Week and Easter celebrations. Were you there? The first verse asks the question, were you there when they crucified my Lord? And the second asks, were you there when they nailed him to the tree? Were you there provides a good setup for what this study is going to be about, because yes, people were there when they crucified our Lord. And it's in this study that we'll take a look at some of these characters, and hopefully at the very least, their stories will inspire us to reflect on our own. So far in this study, we've looked at the bystanders and Simon the Cyrene, the two criminals who were crucified with Jesus, and last week we looked at the Roman centurion and his confession. In each of these characters, we've discovered some lessons that speak to us today, that are relevant for us today. Tonight, let's look at the women who were present, first in general, and then our focus will narrow to the words of Jesus to his mother as recorded in the Gospel of John. The Synoptic Gospels, that's Matthew, Mark, and Luke, tell us that the women were present from a distance. And when one compares their accounts, it gets confusing as to just who was present. The names are not consistent, and it is further complicated by names that were very common in that day and Greek grammar. It is confusing if I had diagrams tonight, much less in our Zoom format that is pretty much just verbal. So for time and simplicity's sake, I'm not going down that rabbit hole. I'm not going to get into the roll call of who's who and who's present and who's absent. Otherwise, it would quickly turn into the classic who's on first comedy routine. In the Synoptic Gospels, and this is important to understand, the presence of the women reminds us that Jesus's male followers were not present. The men all fled. In general, in the Synoptics, the women view the crucifixion from a distance. They're at a distance probably for safety reasons, but they were present. Now, before I get to John's account, I want to briefly mention something that we read about in Luke. This event happens on the way to the cross, right after Simon from Cyrene was compelled to carry the cross of Jesus. In Luke 23, verse 27, we read, a large crowd was following. Many of the women were beating their breast and wailing for him. Now, this is usually understood as a sign of grief and mourning. And Jesus's response backs up that interpretation, for Jesus then tells them not to weep for him, but for themselves. And once again references his prediction of the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem that would indeed come a few decades later in the year 70. But Amy Jill Levine, in her book, Witness at the Cross, which is one of my resources for this study, she opens the door for some other interpretations. She writes, quote, there are better understandings of these women. For example, the daughters of Jerusalem could be lamenting the execution of a man they regarded as a prophet and healer. For like Luke's centurion at the cross, they know that Jesus was a righteous man, or as the Greek says, an innocent man who was falsely condemned. They could be lamenting the miscarriage of justice, and behind it, the power of Rome. End of quote. If the interpretation of the women's actions can be expanded like Amy Jill Levine ponders, it certainly challenges us to consider our actions when we see miscarriages of justice. Jesus told us that when we do for the least of these, the oppressed, the poor, the imprisoned, and the marginalized, we do it unto him. Now, let's move on to the Gospel of John. And you've probably picked up that John's crucifixion story is different from the synoptics. For instance, there is no Simon of Cyrene, no mockery from bystanders, no cry of abandonment from Jesus, no midday darkness, no tearing of the temple curtain, and there's nothing about a centurion. But then John adds some details that the synoptics do not have. For example, only John talks about a dispute between Pilate and the Judean leadership over the wording of the sign that's posted above Jesus on the cross. It is John that tells us about the words of Jesus to his mother and the beloved disciple. It's John that tells us about the breaking of the legs of the two criminals beside Jesus and the Roman soldier's spear thrust into Jesus's side and Jesus's last words, "It is finished." Now, for the rest of the study, however, I want to focus on Jesus's words to his mother and the presence of the unnamed beloved disciple. Unlike the Synoptic Gospels, and even though John never names her, Mary, the mother of Jesus, is with Jesus from the very beginning of his ministry all the way through to the end. And I'll pick up for tonight's study in John 19, verse 25. Standing close to Jesus's cross, I hope that you've noticed something immediately. The synoptics have the women standing at a distance. John have the women standing right at the cross. Standing close to Jesus's cross were his mother, his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary of Magdala. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing there, he said to his mother, "Here is your son." Then he said to his disciple, "Here is your mother." From that moment, the disciple took her into his household. Now, a couple of quick thoughts. First, we again see Jesus's concern and love toward others, even in the midst of his pain and suffering. He has already spoken forgiveness for all, for they know not what they do. And he has spoken to one of the criminals crucified with him, telling him that today you will be with me in paradise. And now Jesus shows his love for his mother by making sure she is taken care of, which is for us a reminder to love our families, but it's also a reminder that we need to minister to the families of victims left behind. Secondly, even though it isn't a part of John's gospel, I am reminded of Simeon's prophecy when Mary and Joseph presented Jesus in the temple as an infant in Luke 2. In regards to Mary, Simeon prophesies that, quote, "a sword will pierce your innermost being too." That statement has always been understood as a reference to the grief and suffering Mary would experience when Jesus is executed. And now here in John, Jesus says to his mother on the cross, as he's on the cross, here is your son. Let's not forget Mary's extraordinary love. Let's not forget Mary's extraordinary commitment, her service, and her suffering as the mother of Jesus. But I also want us to understand what Jesus is doing when he tells the unnamed and mysterious beloved disciple, here is your mother. As he did earlier in his ministry, Jesus redefined what it means to be family, specifically the family of God. In the Gospel of Mark, which doesn't have a birth story and no preordained knowledge of Jesus's mission, Jesus's mother and siblings early on in his ministry come to visit him, and they send word to him that they are waiting outside. And Jesus replied, who is my mother? Who are my siblings? And looking around at everybody that was in the room with him, Jesus said, here are my mother. Here are my siblings. Whoever does the will of God, that person is my mother and sibling. And now at the cross, Jesus echoes that message. And that message is that we have a responsibility to one another. There is indeed a shared humanity among us. And let me echo a little bit of my sermon from this past Sunday about the parable of the prodigal son. One of the many lessons that the prodigal son teaches us is that there is a shared humanity among us. The older son in the parable complained to his father about that son of yours, and in response, the father told his older son, that brother of yours. And then in 2 Corinthians 5, Paul reminds the church not to view the other from an earthly or human point of view, but to remember and to see each other as belonging to one another. And I'll repeat what I said on Sunday. How much better would it be if we could really see each other as our siblings? If we lived our life every day knowing that the people that we come in contact to, that we have a shared humanity with. You know, I was thinking, you know, if I knew that my sister was being mistreated, one of my biological sisters was being mistreated, I'd do everything I could to advocate for them and care for them. And what the Bible challenges us to do is to take that a step beyond our immediate biological family. When we see injustice, when we see a hurt, when we see a need, whatever it is, even in our daily conversations, to see each other as siblings, if we could, it's a challenge, but if we could only do that, how much better our lives would be, our world would be, and our churches would be. And I think that's a challenge that we receive at the cross from Jesus's words as the women stood close by, and specifically to his mother, look, here is your son. Then he said to his disciple, here is your mother. We are family. I close tonight's Bible study with the words of Amy Jill Levine. Quote, Mary Magdalene, the mother of Jesus, and the other women in John's account witnessed Jesus die. They carry that pain, that anguish, that the death of a loved one prompts. But their hearts will rejoice because the cross is never the end of the story. The women at the cross have been ignored or reduced to models of simple piety. These women risked their lives. For women were also executed by the state. Some risked their marriages or their relationships with their children. For the Gospels, as well as Israel's scriptures, women were mothers, but they were also much more. Joanna, Mary Magdalene, Salome, none is identified as a mother. The Bible celebrates marriage and childbirth, but it also celebrates women's religious devotion, patronage, pilgrimage, witness, and a host of other matters not determined by marital status, gender, or sexuality. When Jesus states woman, he is not restricting his conversation partner to a gender role. He is making sure she is noticed. God's abundant grace and peace to you.